Hi listeners, Jason here. We are excited to finally announce registrations for the biggest psych health and safety community event ever. The inaugural The Psych Health and Safety Conference will be held at the Sofitel Wentworth, Sydney, June 19 to 20, 2024 and offer concurrent virtual attendance. It'll feature live podcast recordings with OG researchers including Christina Maslach and Michael Leiter of Burnout fame, Psych Health and Safety USA podcast host I. David Daniels, Australian super experts including the likes of David Burrows, a special 10-year anniversary integrated approaches to workplace mental health panel with authors Tony Lamontagna, Angela Martin and Kat Page, hand-picked case studies from organisations doing it well, and a very special interview with plaintiff Zagi Kozarov by Catherine Dunlop on that High Court case which we previously covered on the podcast. This event will sell out. Get in quick to secure tickets at early bird prices for the 2-day conference, pre-conference masterclasses, and the VIP dinner. The first 200 in-person registrations also get a copy of her latest book, The Burnout Challenge, signed by Christina Maslach herself. Find out more and register at www.psychhealthandsafetyconference.com. Now, on to this episode.
From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Banshee, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we usually have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area, but today is another expert series episode. This will be our last new episode for the 2023 year before we go on a 5-week hiatus. We'll be taking a much needed break before returning with our first new episode for 2024 on January 16th. So we thought it would be a good opportunity to take stock of what we have learned in the past year and conjecture about what we can expect for 2024 in Australia and internationally. With me to talk through this, I have my regular co-host and Flourish DX Global Head of Psychological Health and Safety, Joelle Mitchell. How today, Joelle?
I'm limping towards the Christmas break, I think.
You and me both. I'd say I'm actually commando crawling. I think I've commented to people. It's been a big year, that's for sure.
It has been. It's been intense.
Yeah. Obviously conferences, travel, all the rest on top of the usual workload is pretty demanding. And I think at this time of the year, everyone's starting to wind down and we're very happy to be almost about to start winding down ourselves, which would be nice.
Yeah. I'm not thinking about winding down yet.
What are you talking about? You've been doing a 4-day week you've been first experimental guinea pig for the last 6 weeks.
For the 4-day work week.
Yeah.
That's been a fatigue management strategy, Jason, to help me survive until my leave over the Christmas break.
Yeah, not completely burn out before you hit Christmas.
That's it. Yeah, so that I can, actually come back after Christmas instead of being exhausted.
Yeah, and not be exhausted over your Christmas break either, right? So we say that, right? Yeah.
Yep. Nobody wants to spend their hard-earned holiday time being unwell.
Yeah, I'd much prefer to be laying by a pool somewhere with a constant buzz for 2 weeks straight. Much better.
So the only difference really there is that you're by the pool instead of at your desk?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, it's 10 a.m. somewhere, right? So
how are you, Jason?
Yeah, like I said, a little bit probably more tired than normal. I did have a 3-hour delay thanks to an airline that will remain unnamed last night. I got in about 11 o'clock. I was at the World Congress the last few days, and it wasn't just a late night last night, but it was a lot of socialising at the event as well that, usually went right into the wee hours. Those people like Dave Prove and Andrew Barrett, they can I don't know how they do it. I seriously do not know how they have the energy. I need my sleep. But I was happy to stay on Perth time while I was over there, given it was only a 3-day trip.
Mm. So what were your highlights from the Congress, the days that you were there?
Yeah, so I think overall the structure of the program was really good in that they didn't just put in too much content. So, you go to conferences sometimes, it's just session after session, then you have like maybe a 15-minute break.
Yeah, and there's like 5 concurrent sessions running at the same time or whatever.
Yeah, so this, because it is a World Congress, they did have plenty of concurrent sessions, and you really had to pick and choose which ones you're going to. But they did have like the first day between the two workshops, I think it was a 2 or 3 hour break in between. And given it was day one in particular, right, there was obviously going to be lots of chances to run into people for the first time that you might not have seen in a while. So the conference did a really good job of giving people opportunity to connect, given that was definitely my, the thing I wanted to do. I like to think we're a bit on the cutting edge when it comes to psychological health and safety here, and providing people with the best information on this. So I didn't expect to learn too much and in this space, even though there was a lot of content on there. And in the end, I didn't get to as many sessions as I might have liked to have done, because I was, I guess, busy catching up with people. But that was my primary objective, so I was happy. So thanks, Sky, for creating the opportunity for so many people to come together and to be able to connect.
Yeah, good. And that when Sky and Andrew were on our podcast a few weeks ago, that was one of the their objectives really for the Congress, wasn't it, to give people that opportunity to do that networking and catch up with colleagues that they might not have seen for quite some time.
Yeah, that's right. And there was, plenty of good social events where, people who maybe didn't have an extensive network or had travelled from international and didn't know anyone locally, plenty of opportunities for them to catch up in different networking things. Obviously, we've got a really great community that we've built. So it was quite nice walking around and people going, "Hey, Jason, I know the face, but we've never actually chatted." So it was awesome to be able to see so many people and to have that first face-to-face connection. But also really enjoyed, there was some side events. So David Proven and Safety Exchange, we host their psych health and safety content on their platform. So it was great to do something with them. Interestingly and coincidentally, Rebecca McCulloch, who's a friend of the podcast, had also put on a networking thing, which was at the same pub as the Safety Exchange one. So I got to go to both, which was fantastic. Ended up being a long afternoon and evening.
Such a social butterfly you are.
I know, but then
two dates at the same time.
I know, right? It was great. Beck was completely. I'd forgotten to tell her that there might be this other event kicking off at any point, but that was quite fun. So we just kind of continued on with that group, and then the Tuesday night was great because we wanted to get some customers and friends together for a nice dinner. So we went to the Star and had a nice restaurant with restaurant meal with about 20 of us. Which is really nice to sit down and just have a great social event, pull together some people who are like-minded, pretty senior people with, who are trying to do stuff in this area, and just get them talking, give them that opportunity. So, that was some of my highlights, but it was all around the socializing, funnily enough, and, connecting with people that, you don't get to see all in one place too often.
Good.
So, Joelle, as
Jason.
we mentioned at the top, it's been a big year. And in fact, this is actually the end of our 3rd year of podcasting together. Can you believe it?
I can.
Yeah, I gotta
say. Thinking about my expectations when we first started, no, I wouldn't have expected that we would still be going with it now.
Yeah, I'm obviously an optimist, and I am someone who always looks to the future. So yeah, of course, I thought we'd be doing this forever. I did, as I often do, have our first podcast episode, the clips from that. That's kind of high up on my LinkedIn profile, and I was like, Joelle looks so much younger there. I really, I really worked you hard the last 3 years, Joelle. I think. Putting up with me for 3 years, I should say, probably is.
Thanks.
But like you said, you didn't know what to expect with the podcast. You didn't know what to expect working with me.
It's true.
Yeah. But I think listeners
it's probably not all you, Jason. It could be just also time, right?
Yeah, actually, someone commented on me when we were there. He's actually just started listening to the podcast from the very beginning, and he's like, "Poor Joelle, she just got so many."
That was a rough time.
all all the construction issues and water and
Yep.
yeah, all the rest. I'm like, well, look, we did move on from that. And we did try and be a little bit more lighthearted in our intros. So it does get better. So but it's been a lot of fun, right? And many people have commented to me that they like, I guess, how we play off each other. You're definitely the one that keeps me in line, and I think they appreciate you keeping me in line.
Someone
too.
has to.
Otherwise,
Good Lord.
Yeah,
You would get cancelled.
Yep. I think we can both agree on that one.
Mm.
So let's think about then, like, because we've been doing this for 3 years now, but this last year has been really incredible, I guess, with the changes that we've seen. We've seen some new exciting things happen in the past year. We've seen some same old challenges rear their heads again. And we've got some, some real opportunities I think we've identified for companies who are, continuing to move their strategies forward in the psych health and safety space. So I guess we'll start with we've got 6 things here in particular, I guess, we want to talk through. But the first one is that regulations are actually working to get organisations moving at a rate and in the right direction that we have not seen for the last 2 or 3 decades.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, right? Because on the one hand, we get people sort of telling us that their board and exec aren't really bothered about enforcement or about like fines and prosecution and that sort of thing, because if you look at the penalty provisions and the types of fines that they actually could get through prosecution, it's sort of insignificant for them. Yet at the same time, we're seeing those companies still moving in response to the regulations. So it's an interesting one. I guess there's an element of reputation that comes along with that, and probably a little bit of peer pressure from their competitors in the industry as well. I know with a lot of organisations, they're always keen to be sort of seen to be the first one to do something or to be leading the way, and especially in the area of health and safety, there does seem to be always this competition to be sort of the leader, to be out ahead of everybody else. So there's maybe some of that driving it as well. It's been interesting. I think a lot of it is, organizations who have known for a long time that this is something that they should be doing because they see or they understand what the benefits or the potential benefits are to their business. And perhaps what the regulations have done is given them just that little bit more weight to the argument that's tipped it over into this is something that we have to do now, as opposed to, we need to prioritize something else.
Yeah. So as you say, we have heard anecdotally that, if you're $1 billion company, getting a max fine even of less than $500,000 is probably not going to be enough to influence behaviour change, particularly when you look at the cost of compliance potentially in comparison to the fine. But like you say, the peer pressure and wanting to demonstrate that they are actually running a good business is important. I did run into Jim Kelly and Ian Firth at the World Congress, and Jim and Ian had both been on our podcast previously, and I'd commented that even with the code of practice that had come out earlier, and there'd been guidelines from Safe Work Australia out since 2018 or what have you, that it wasn't until the regulations hit that we actually saw a huge influx of activity. I think back a year ago when we were maybe having one conversation with a new company that was interested in us supporting them maybe once every fortnight or so. And now it feels like we're having 3 to 5 conversations with new companies every single day. So the level of activity has definitely gone up through the roof. And nothing historically has actually made that change as much as what we're seeing right now.
Yeah.
So the other thing that's probably prompting companies is improvement notices. So the regulators are becoming more active. I believe Libby Brooke, friend of ours again, is in Victoria, is leading the charge in terms of size of team. I believe she's up to about 30 people who have more of a focus on psychosocial in their inspection activities. So, we are seeing the regulators arm up, but Victoria are definitely leading the charge in terms of the capacity of their team to actually enforce the let's face it, like existing obligations, because they don't have new regulations yet, but existing obligations, and they seem to be the ones that are probably doing the most activity in this space.
Yeah, and I think that that's probably an important thing to distinguish as well, is the difference between an improvement notice and a prosecution or an infringement notice. In that, for the majority of regulators around Australia, their improvement notices aren't published, so we're not actually privy to how much regulatory action is actually being taken in this space, because they sit sort of below that threshold for publishing. So yeah, I think that probably is also a significant driver for a lot of organisations, and a lot of the time, an improvement notice can actually be much more costly than a fine or an infringement as well. And if we look at there was a New South Wales enforceable undertaking published, and that was in excess of $2 million, the estimated costs of that undertaking. And that's, absent of prosecution or infringement. That's basically the PCBU agreeing to that instead of being prosecuted. So yeah, the notices are a very powerful instrument that regulators can use, and in my experience, they're generally a lot more effective and efficient in actually bringing organisations to a safer state than something like prosecution is.
Yeah, and I don't think the health and safety people that we interact with on the regular are upset when they get the improvement notice, because often they've been banging the drum for a while, going, "What we're doing is not sufficient," and maybe senior leadership don't agree, and then they get the notice of improvement and then go, "See, we have to do something in this space. You don't have a choice now, right?"
Yeah, they might not be super happy to have the improvement notice. I'm sure that it probably doesn't do wonders for their own performance objectives for the year. But
Well,
yeah, it's certainly.
This is the problem, though, right? Like, if you get it and then you have to respond to it immediately, that's going to increase your own workload because you still have everything else. So obviously much better to put it in as a planned kind of strategic approach versus having to jump and do something maybe half-heartedly just to meet the requirements of the improvement.
Yep.
Yeah, but we are definitely when having first calls with prospective clients, often we'll ask them, so why now? Like, this is something that's been around for a while now. Why now? And they're like, oh, might have gotten visited by the regulator this week, and we're expecting something. So yeah, it's interesting, right? We've been talking about the carrot versus the stick for some time, and we've been using a lot of carrots historically. But the stick works. And I know people like Martin Shane in Canada are really going, hey, look at Australia, look how much activity this is actually driving. Yes, we have a voluntary standard, which, back in 2013 was really ahead of its time internationally. But companies still are not adopting this at the same rate as what is happening in Australia, thanks to the regulatory changes. So it's really amazing to be witnessing this very much firsthand. How organisations are just deciding that they do finally need to move really quickly, and it's not the carrot; it's the stick, right? Because the carrots are still there; they remain the same as what they were a decade ago.
Yeah, and like I say, I think that it's not that the carrots aren't attractive, but it's that I think the combination of those carrots plus that stick is really just what's nudging organisations over the edge.
Yeah, so watch this space if you're international and you're maybe jealous of how much activity is happening in Australia. I believe this will be a good case study of what's happening as a country, and I can definitely see other countries following suit, pointing to the experience that we're going through right now. I guess the second thing I wanted to talk about is that concept confusion still abounds, particularly when talking about things like psychological safety versus psychological health and safety. and those that listen to the podcast regularly will know I'll always get a twitch. And I so often get tagged on posts when people are conflating the two. And so I probably see it more than what I should.
Are you going to shout out and ask people to stop tagging you in those because it's raising your blood pressure?
Yeah, it would. I'd be a lot more relaxed and chill. I'm pretty chill anyway, right? But I'd be even more chill if I didn't have to see that stuff all the time.
You'd be asleep.
But yeah, there's obviously a lot of people trying to get their head around this space, and there's people who have followed Amy Edmondson's work and Tim Clark and these kinds of people, and they might be more from a wellbeing or HR or people and culture type background, and not really have been exposed to health and safety legislation or human factors before. And then they think they get it. They're like, oh yeah, I know all about psychological safety. But we're seeing that, people are conflating the two quite often, and in some cases giving very bad advice to clients based on a limited understanding of what's actually required.
Yeah, and what I think that the particular concern there is that when there are service providers who are putting themselves forward as subject matter experts, but they're making those really basic mistakes, and actually even, we see that in marketing material, where there is just that absolute conflation of the two. The terms are used interchangeably, and the concepts are used interchangeably as well. So they're not even that they're sort of using the terms to describe one thing. They're actually they're just very confused about the whole thing, and they're not it's fine to do both, I think, if that's what you want to do, but you need to be clear what those two things are, how they're different from each other, and yes, certainly how they do interact. But yeah, just mashing them all together isn't the way to do it.
Yeah, and I'm sick of people saying, oh, but you need psychological health and safety to be able to do psychosocial risk management. And I'm like, do you really know what psychological safety is? And I'm probably going to be that annoyed, Joelle, from this discussion right now that I'm probably going to do another post on this on Friday. Sandra Lamb did a post actually about something similar last night, and I was on the plane on the way home and I had to respond. And I was like, all right, well, this is how Amy Edmondson conceptualizes psychological safety. If you look at the measure, there's 7 items in her measure to measure psychological safety. One of them is about people's willingness to raise up concerns, or be willing to raise up negative things, basically. But often people will say psychological safety is about raising concerns, or like if there's a safety issue, you'd be willing to raise it. That's like 1/7 of what psychological safety is actually all about. So I think more people are probably talking about employee safety voice, which is all around how willing employers to raise safety-related matters at work, rather than psychological safety, which is just such a broad construct. And as David Burrows has pointed out before, it's kind of like Maslow's hammer, in that it's like we can use this for everything, and it's because it's such a broad construct, right? It's like people can apply it to pretty much anything. I think I'm going to do a post probably on Friday this week of this is how you measure psychological safety. This is how you measure employee safety voice. What is it that you're actually talking about? What behaviors are you trying to drive? And then maybe, employee safety voice is where you should be focusing your attention and the wealth of research in that area versus something like psychological safety, which is a very broad brush approach to try and get the outcome that you want.
All right. So listeners, you'll be able to tell if Jason has published that post or not, because that will be in advance of this episode going live.
Oh, it's actually Thursday. No, I can't be asked. It'll be next week.
Yeah, that would be tomorrow. Yeah. Not tomorrow.
No, not tomorrow. No. I was thinking it was Wednesday. I'm just all turned around. It will not, but it will probably be maybe after this episode.
After this episode airs. So there you go, listeners. Keep your eyes peeled for that one.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to number 3, we're seeing that despite our best efforts of trying to educate the market through the podcast, through the webinars that we do, through our professional practice program, that there's a growing understanding that companies need specialist support for psychological health and safety. So I guess what we've been trying to do is, particularly for generalist health and safety practitioners, to kind of broaden their understanding and maybe increase their capability a bit more in this space. But we're still seeing that it probably, like a lot of hygiene or human factors areas, right, probably will require ongoing specialists in this area.
Yeah, and look, I think that that's sort of part of the role of the generalist as well, is to recognise when they need to call in a specialist for assistance. And I think like what we're seeing in terms of demand for that specialist support is very much in getting started and getting things established, right? Getting the systems of work in place, helping the organisation to work out how do we do this. And obviously our goal is that we help them through that process, and then they can kind of be independent of us and carry that on without us. But yeah, I think that there is an important aspect of that to build in. Well, when do you need help? As there is with any other safety issue.
Yeah, so we are seeing in Australia, there is a growing number of jobs being advertised quite frequently now. And in fact, that's why on our mailing list now, we have our jobs board that goes out fortnightly with, some of the jobs that we think are quite interesting in this space. I'd say most companies don't need a full-time person in this area once they're set up, as you're saying.
Yeah.
Once you understand your gaps, once you've got your strategy on how you're going to meet compliance and have a safe system of work, once you've got your consultation methods and how you're going to be monitoring your hazards and controls, it's something that probably can be done with relatively little input. And so we're finding, some of our software subscription deals that we have or combinations that we have where we put on a layer of customer support, that 20, 30 days a year of consulting support as needed is probably plenty rather than having someone on the books, for the whole year. Obviously, if you're in a very large organization, we've got some clients, for example, that have, 5 to 10,000 plus employees. Yeah, maybe that would be a large enough scale to have a dedicated resource in this area. But if you're not operating in that sort of scale, then you probably don't need a dedicated resource.
Yeah, it's, I guess, size and complexity and hazard profile, I suppose, it's sort of the things that you'd want to think about there as in terms of whether you'd need a full-time position for that or not.
Yeah. So we are still trying, right? So we will continue to do podcasts. We'll continue to do webinars. We'll continue to run our professional practice program. But yeah, I think we did a podcast on this about a year or so ago now, right? It was called Apps Don't Fix Workplace Mental Health. We actually realized that the way we engage with companies needed to change back then. Whereas before we were just saying, well, if we build the tools to help companies to consult with staff better and to address risks and manage those risks through a software platform, that would be enough. And then we realized, no, companies still need a lot of hand-holding to set up their systems and to continue that they remain on track with their safe system of work. So yeah, that's something that we've just doubled down on. It was great to have Andrew and Heather join the team in the last few months, and I dare say we've probably got another couple of psychs who'll be joining the team in the first quarter of next year as well, given the demand in this area.
Yes, it's exciting times to be us.
Yeah. And you, Joel, you've got your growing team, and everyone that we employ are people who actually know what they're doing before they hit the ground. So I guess we don't have the luxury at this stage yet at our scale to have graduates in the role. As much as I know you and Heather are really interested in growing the profession, and I know you both actively supervise people who are going through their master's programs in organisational psychology. I guess we don't have the that flexibility to have that level role in yet.
Yeah, and I think that's also about recognising and being realistic about the level of support that a graduate needs to be able to get to a point where they can do the job really well, and just being quite honest that we don't have the capacity to be able to provide that level of support at this stage.
Yeah. So graduates, if you are interested in going into the field, we're happy to talk. We just probably don't have any roles for you just yet. But we are, that's something I'm looking forward to in 2024, growing the team. And I'm sure there's plenty of people in our network that we already know and maybe have even spoken about on the podcast previously that will hopefully be joining the team over the coming year. And, supporting our clients, which would be great. Okay, so let's talk about number 4 then, which is when we do have early conversations with companies, some of the objections that are still coming up. So these are very much par for the course. If you ever get on a call with me where you're asking for support for your own organisation, you do not need to apologise for any of these things because pretty much every conversation, these things come up with a new company, right? So one is around the good old survey fatigue. We do not want to do a risk assessment because we do enough surveys. No one wants another survey. We do not have capacity to do any further consultation. So we are not going to do a risk assessment. We just want to, but we do want to say we've done a risk assessment. How do you deal with that? Given that obviously under the Workplace Health and Safety Act, so this is something that maybe HR and people and culture people are not as familiar with. But when you work in health and safety, there is legislation that governs how you must go about certain activities. And under the Workplace Health and Safety Act, there is a duty to consult. So how do you get around this whole idea of particularly HR and people and culture, which usually own the engagement and culture survey, saying we've got survey fatigue, there's no capacity to run any more surveys, but the health and safety practitioner knowing they've got a duty to consult workers around psychosocial hazards?
Yeah, so it varies between organisations in terms of what works, and it's generally about exploring a little bit more first. What are the items on your engagement survey or those other data points that you collect, and actually exploring those, and then looking at, well, what do these actually provide in terms of what the regs require, and then where are the gaps? And most of that is going to, well, firstly, you're probably not actually asking people about all of your reasonably foreseeable hazards in your engagement survey. Pretty unlikely that that's going to be the case. Secondly, you're certainly not asking them about exposure, which is really what leads you to be able to talk about risk. So, what the regulations ask for isn't just whether something is there or not, but how severe is its impact on your workforce, how often are people exposed, and for how long. So that, I think sometimes giving that clarification can be enough to help stakeholders see why their engagement survey isn't going to do the job. But that wasn't what you asked me, was it? You're asking me about survey fatigue.
Yeah, but I guess we can kind of mash them two together, right? Because that kind of is the solution, right? Yeah, it's like we've got survey fatigue. We're just going to use the engagement survey, right? Because we've already got
and it's, I guess, firstly, why do you have fatigue, and where does that come from? If people are fatigued, that suggests that you're over surveying them and they're not seeing value, or they're not seeing that there's a useful or a beneficial trade-off for them, right? You're asking them to take some of their time and redistribute it to completing this survey, giving you information about their views on things. If they don't see any useful change or action or acknowledgement even coming out of that, then they're less motivated to participate in future consultation. So, Jason, you say this fairly often, survey fatigue is really learned helplessness.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
Yeah, well, I actually got that from Dave Burrows, right? So, and there's some other people who have picked up on that, but it's usually not survey fatigue; it's lack of action fatigue, which is the primary driver of like people giving that feedback. I'm sick of telling you the same thing and nothing changing about my experience of work. And so, yeah, unfortunately, that is the case because companies or people have not seen any benefit from previous consultation. So, I guess this is a whole we could do a whole podcast. And in fact, the last webinar that we're going to be running for the year, which is on the 12th of December, is going to be on this exact topic, which is, people ask, can we just use our engagement survey as a psychosocial risk assessment? We'll talk about the limitations of that, and what would be best practice if you're considering going down that route. And I can give you one right now, and that is to distance your psychosocial risk assessment activities as far away as you can from your engagement survey, particularly if you're getting survey fatigue kind of feedback, because people are then not probably valuing your employee engagement survey process. And you want to make sure that people see this as a different process that's going to drive different sorts of outcomes.
Yeah, and that's that's one of the reasons why we're quite deliberate in how we name our tools, that we do actually call it a psychosocial risk assessment, and not a hazard survey or something
Or
like
a well-being survey. The number of clients that ask, "Oh, don't like this idea of calling it risk. It sounds so negative. Can we call it something else?" Like, well, a risk assessment is actually a legal responsibility now, so you might as well call it what it is. And then you can actually tell people why it's a mandatory activity for them to participate in, because as an employee of a PCBU, they are a duty holder, and there is an obligation for them to participate in reasonable health and safety activities, and this would be one of them. Again, so distance yourself from this idea of psychosocial risk management being a voluntary wellbeing type initiative. This is very much about understanding what is it that can potentially cause harm about the way we do work, and then what are the things we need to prioritize to make sure that people are not harmed. Which kind of leads us to the next part of this question, right? Or the thing that we wanted to do is the fear of rattlesnakes. So if we don't do a risk assessment, Joelle, that's great, because then we don't know about any risks. And some leaders, I think, would prefer to live in this land where they just don't know any better because they don't ask the question.
Yeah, so I guess the full context of that fear of rattlesnakes is, people don't want to look under the stone because they're afraid that there's a rattlesnake there, but the rattlesnake is there whether they look or not. And the same goes for your psychosocial hazards. So, the legislation doesn't say to control risks associated with hazards that you know about. It says control risks associated with reasonably foreseeable hazards. So whether or not you've actually asked your workforce about them if you haven't asked your workforce about them, that doesn't absolve you of your legal duties. Those duties are still there. And if you don't ask your workforce about them, then you failed to meet your duties. And if something does go wrong, and if you do get to a point of an inspection or a prosecution, then the fact that you hadn't done that consultation is probably going to stand against you.
Yeah, and that actually has come up a number of times now. So there was the coroner's court in Victoria that were prosecuted due to a fatality that occurred, which was, I think that was back in 2018. And that was tied back to the person being in a very toxic work environment. So it was definitely work-related suicide. And one of the things in the prosecution that was reported in The Age in Victoria, that said that they made note of the fact that they had failed to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment over a few years, despite the foreseeable hazards in that work environment that the young lady was in, unfortunately.
Yeah, and so a lot of those things are captured in other sources of organizational data collection as well. So I think you can't even really reasonably say that you've got plausible deniability if you don't actually do that risk assessment, because you still have information about the presence of a lot of those hazards. You just haven't gone the next step of of exploring exposure and looking at how best to control it.
Yeah, and we've got to say the state of knowledge, right, regarding foreseeable hazards is increasing on the daily as well. Like the information that is being shared would definitely make it not hard for pretty much any organisation in any industry with any sorts of roles, with a bit of a desktop review of industry data, be able to identify what are the key things that you should be aware of without even.
And the codes of practice also say these are your reasonably foreseeable hazards. If you haven't actually gone to the effort of doing hazard identification, here they are.
Yeah,
and so obviously that's not an exhaustive list, but that really just eliminates any argument of we didn't know, because that code of practice is there as the legal basis for what you are expected to know.
Yeah. And we've seen the regulators probably be most heavy-handed where there are things that are foreseeable, and probably those high severity things if they're not controlled. So frontline workers, for example, being exposed to trauma. Actually, one that
sexual
was really
harassment.
Sexual harassment is another one, yeah. There was another one that was really interesting that came out this month from New Zealand, which, again, don't have the same regulatory drivers in Australia, but have their act is very similar to ours, given that they pretty much copy and pasted it. Basically, the story is, and Joel and I had a bit of a giggle about this because it was quite funny how it all eventuated. But what's not funny is that we know that rail operators are unfortunately exposed to fatalities, because that's how people sometimes choose to kill themselves walking in front of trains. It happens too regularly.
Yeah, there's also like cars that think that they can beat the train at the crossing and those types of things as well.
Yeah, so fatalities happen, right? It is definitely a foreseeable risk, which is a high severity kind of psychosocial hazard exposure. Low frequency, hopefully, in comparison to other things like, say, workload or lack of autonomy, but it is high severity and needs to be managed. Now, the union flagged with the rail operator that their control of EAP, like here's the phone number if you witness a fatality to go talk to someone, that was not a suitable control. And the rail operator basically said, hold my beer, we know what a risk control is, EAP is all we need, and we're going to go talk to the regulator about it. And the regulator's like, no, that's not good enough. Here's a notice of improvement. And so, what we're seeing is that, you don't need to necessarily have done a staff consultation, identified the rattlesnakes through that to have a duty to make sure that risks to employees are managed satisfactorily.
Yeah.
So that kind of moves us on to the last part of this area, which is another objection, which is around leadership. So senior leaders often are worried if we consult with staff, we're going to identify all of these issues, and then we're going to need to take action to address them. And what's the cost of that going to be, and how many resources are going to be required to actually address that? And I guess you'd see that too, right, Joelle? Like you generally come on board after we get a client on board, and so generally we've overcome that objection at some point when we've talked to a client and the leadership understand, well, it's not that big an issue. Any comments on that one, like what your experience is, I guess maybe, and is that really true?
Look, you there's a wide range of actions that we can look at, right? And some of them probably will end up being big and complex. Most of certainly the first iteration of this work that we do with clients, we're not really seeing those big sort of whole of organization system type changes. What we're really seeing is firstly, these are the areas, the teams, the functions, whatever in our organization who are struggling at the moment, who are at highest risk. So let's prioritize them as a start. Let's understand what the context is for them. What's creating this hazard profile for them? And so what are the drivers? And that might be, different work streams coming into them. It might be, issues with that they don't have clear position descriptions and they don't understand what the boundaries are of their roles. It might be that the way that decisions are made within the team aren't really clear, and so it seems like things are unfair or confusing. Um, so a lot of these issues, when we're talking about it at a team level, they really are. We can develop team level actions to address those issues as well. Um, if we're looking at things like workload, well, what are the sources of work that are coming into the team from the organization or from the client base? And what are some strategies that we can put in place to manage that at the source? So, can we change what our delivery schedules are? For example, how much time we need to turn around a particular piece of work, or, what are the expectations around quality? What are the expectations around sort of feedback and those types of turnarounds. So there's quite a lot of tweaking that we can do at that level, sort of to set expectations around how that work is actually going to be processed and delivered. And so that's not about hiring more people into the team, but that's actually about saying, well, let's look at the work and let's just do a little bit of thinking about how we can make this more efficient. And maybe it's, we don't actually need to be doing all of that stuff. Potentially is another solution as well. So yeah, when we talk about things like work design, we're not necessarily, or we're not always talking about big, scary, sort of whole of organization change. It can be, some really simple or fairly straightforward tweaks that we can make to how things are already running to just reduce those pain points within that workflow or whatever it might be. And those are still work design controls because they are actually changing how work is experienced by people.
Yeah, and I've commented on it before on LinkedIn at least, where I've said, what people want is they want to see action, right, as close as possible to the consultation. So if you say, well, the biggest issue we've got is this massive systemic issue, maybe it's like a outdated IT infrastructure system. You work in a large government department, right? Hugely complex. It's going to take 3 years to actually address this thing properly. If you say that's what we're going to commit to, thanks for your feedback, and it takes 3 years for people's experience of work to change, you're probably going to have 80% turnover in that period of time, and people aren't actually going to see any benefit from the consultation. So small, fast actions, often focused on busy work, as Joelle was saying, more of those hindrance demands, what actually adds no value and takes a lot of time. Can we either eliminate those things or improve those processes so that we have to spend less time doing that? That's the number one way to deal with work overload, which is the most common thing that we see as a hazard that is causing people distress at work. So that is, it doesn't have to be big, right? Sometimes it's about removing a process. I think I've spoken before around role clarity, even, right? Just we found with our marketing team having a 15-minute meeting once a week just to align on what's important, what are the priorities, what's coming up. That was enough to actually deal with probably the largest issue that was in that particular part of the organization. So these things don't have to be big and scary. And really, particularly after your first one, to try and win over people and give them motivation to continue in forthcoming risk assessment processes. Make it quick and fast and something that does actually change their experience of work. So, Joelle, there's some of the objections, and those are some of our responses to those, right? I think it's all really important. And like I said, if you come on and you apologise, you don't need to apologise for any of those things. They're all very common concerns. And they're, in large case, it's due to ignorance that people still have those concerns. And once we get through and educate, then often they're no longer a concern. And particularly when people just start getting in and doing it, right? Then their concerns can be overcome as well, just through their own experience. We had one recently, actually, which is quite a large organisation across 200 sites, right? And they were concerned because they'd had some feedback from a small number of employees about some issues, but when they got a representative sample across the whole organisation, it seemed to be, well, this is just kind of pockets where we've got these issues. It's not a widespread issue. But a risk assessment can really identify what pockets they exist in, and then you can focus your attention on that rather than going, oh, we're going to need to roll something out like across thousands of employees.
Mm.
Cool. All right. Well, what we're now seeing, I guess, in terms of this now being more commonplace in Australia, at least, psychosocial risk assessment and management of risks, is that many companies have started their strategy, and many have chosen to go with, say, a global risk assessment where they, they'll not across the whole globe if they're a international organisation, multinational, but they are focusing on Australia largely. But if we go across all of our employees in a market, which might be hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands, let's understand what is our hazard profile, where does that exist within the organisation. But then they start to realise that they've got a gap in their controls and maybe a gap in how they're monitoring their controls, or maybe have never evaluated it. And, this is something we've spoken about before as well, right, Joelle? Like what the regulations are asking of organisations is essentially Org Psych 101. Before, going forth with a intervention, actually do a diagnosis. Go, well, what is the problem? And try and understand what is the root cause, not just the symptoms, like people are burnt out. Well, great. Yeah, what's causing them to burn out? And how can we address that further upstream? We then put in the intervention, and then we measure to see whether the interventions have been effective or not. So many organisations, because of time and cost, they'll often skip the first bit, the diagnosis, and then they'll skip the last bit going, oh, if we do this thing, it's evidence-based, it's going to work, so we don't need to worry about measuring it. But now, I guess through regulation, we're saying, well, now what is good practice is now actually mandatory practice, which is really nice. But I guess that is nice, but I guess the other thing to acknowledge here is that HR and organisational development, these are not new fields of work. And I guess I can understand how some people working in HR, people and culture, OD, they might get their noses out of joint when health and safety is saying we need to do a risk assessment and we need to control risk, when ultimately the controls sit typically within HR and OD and such. And there are already controls that exist, right? So I think it's kind of a disservice to say to HR practitioners to say, well, we've got to start from scratch here. We've got to do a risk assessment. We need to consult with staff. We need to then, develop controls. Whereas in fact, there has been consultation done, maybe not targeted in the right way, like we were talking about before. It's not an exposure assessment, but you definitely, as an organisation, if you run a regular engagement pulse culture survey, you'll know where your hot pockets are and what are some of your key issues in those areas, right? So you'd understand what a lot of your hazards are. And like Joelle and I mentioned earlier, if you look at any industry data, the code of practice, that sort of thing, you'll understand what your hazards are. Then there's heaps of controls. There's lots of stuff that is being done either to do with the design of work through things like what's our recruitment practice, what is our onboarding practice, what is our leadership development practice, what's our reward and recognition program look like, what's our performance management program. All of these things, if they're done properly, can actually be protective factors for mental health. So there are controls, and then there are other controls, right, which are kind of like your generic workplace mental health controls like resilience training, mindfulness, EAP, mental health first aid, peer support, that sort of thing. So there's lots going on, right? So I'm actually thinking many companies might be better off starting at step 3 of the risk management cycle, which is around assessing the effectiveness of controls. It's actually step 4, which is assessing the effectiveness of controls. Step 3, we put in controls, so they're already in. So it's like, let's now go, and before we go through another cycle, let's actually take stock of where we're at. So that might be, okay, we've got data to identify hazards. We know what the known risks are, right? So we don't necessarily need to assess them at this point. We've got controls in. Now, let's actually go and map the controls that we've got to the hazards or clusters of hazards, and let's review how likely they are to be effective. And when I say that, it might be things like, well, let's review them against the hierarchy of control. And when you do that, and when we do that with our clients, we very often see, hey, you know what? We got very little, if any, at the elimination or work design phase. What we're really looking at is a lot of policies, training, self-care, kind of more reactive type things in place often. And so just by looking at that, looking at things like, is it primary, secondary, tertiary, which we find most tend to be tertiary intervention rather than primary or secondary. Looking at things like, is it reactive versus proactive? Is it organizational level intervention, or is it team specific intervention, noting the different hazard profiles that you might have in the organization? So there's many ways, right? You can actually map the controls that you've got and consider, are these things likely to be effective, or at what kind of level are these controls? And then the next thing is, how are we monitoring these things? How are we monitoring these hazards? How are we monitoring if new hazards are emerging? How are we monitoring the controls and how they're being implemented and how effective they are? And when you do that exercise, very quickly you identify the gaps. Hey, we're missing a lot of controls that should be at the work design level. We're missing a lot of things at the primary prevention level. They're all like secondary or tertiary. We have no data points on how we're actually monitoring these controls to know whether they're effective or not. And so all of those things point to going back to that first stage of the risk management cycle of going, all right, let's go back then and get some data, consult with staff around identifying these hazards, assessing their risk, and putting additional controls in place. So regardless of whether you start at step 1 or step 4 of the risk management cycle, you end up back at step 1, right? It's continuous improvement. But I think, I'm looking forward to 2024, because I actually think we do start at step 4 more commonly. So rather than dealing with all the objections we just mentioned around, we're survey fatigued, leaders are concerned about what they're going to find and what controls we're going to need to put in place, go, well, all right, well, before we consult with staff on that, we've actually consulted with staff on other things related to their experience of work through the engagement survey and whatnot. We've got data, we've got controls. Let's now evaluate that. And then when we go into our next round of consultation, we've got some very much more targeted questions they're asking people, and we're looking for specific sorts of controls to address the gaps that we've identified. So I'm real, as you can tell, I'm really excited about 2024 to do more of that sort of work.
I'm excited for my few weeks off over the Christmas break before we start doing any of that work.
Yeah, and I think that's really leveraging the strengths of our team, right? So having people who've got really good, strong organizational psychology backgrounds, it's not something that a wellness practitioner would be able to do so well. So we're going to leverage the strengths of our team. So like you said, it's not easy work. It's tough work. It does require a lot of subject matter expertise. And that's why we'll continue to obviously employ people from the org site profession, because they've got generally a good skill set in that area. But that'll be fun. Actually, if you're dealing with any of those objections yourself, right? Survey fatigue, can we just use our engagement survey? Fear of rattlesnakes, concerns from leadership about like how much work you're going to have to do on controls. Starting on step 4 is not a bad way to go. And we might even do a webinar, I'm thinking, at the beginning of next year, just to talk through about what does that actually look like as a strategy. Well, Joelle, I'm thinking that's probably enough for today.
I think so too.
It's getting towards the end of the year, and so we're just phoning it in now at this point. So
the end of the day, the end of the year.
So it's been great, Joelle. I guess hosting with you over the last year. Really, thank you for keeping me in line, and for all the effort that you put into finding all the awesome, juicy clips that we put on LinkedIn. Looking forward to 2024 doing more of these podcasts with you and building the community even further.
Thank you, Jason. I would like to thank our listeners for keeping us going with these recordings as well. If we didn't have people listening every week, we wouldn't probably carry on. Well, we might, but guests might be less inclined to join us if we didn't have listeners who were interested in hearing what they had to say. So, it's really a wonderful community that we've built with this podcast, and it continues to grow, which is fantastic and probably much bigger than either of us expected when we started out.
That's right. And thanks to our guests, right, who have come on the podcast as well and given us their time and subject matter expertise. Hopefully we've given them a good platform, right, to share their ideas. And I think in many ways, every academic, and I did bring this up with Tony LaMontagne when he said he had a new article. I'm like, hey, more people are going to find out about that article if you talk about it on our podcast for 10 minutes and putting it behind a paywall somewhere. So I think it's a good way to distribute really good information. And I'm really pleased with the caliber of people that we have on the podcast. And really looking forward to June of next year when we have our conference, right? And bringing them all together, all of these great people, many, I should say, that have been on our podcast over the last few years. And it should be a really great community event as well to see people in person, given I've just had a few days of that at the World Congress. I'm really looking forward to the next opportunity.
Yes, it's very exciting.
Awesome. Well, listeners, that brings us to the end of our final episode for 2023. We really appreciate you being on this journey with us and, joining in with us when you can. Do reach out if there's anything in particular that you think we should be covering in 2024, or if there's any particular guests that you'd love to have on the podcast, particularly if you can make an introduction to those guests. That would be much appreciated, as we're always looking for good people to feature. We do record these over video, same as today. You'll be able to see Joelle's awesome background with some Star Wars paraphernalia and whatnot. If you check out the video, we do put clips on, and we'll put a couple of clips on, no doubt, from this episode on the FlourishDX LinkedIn page as well. As always, reach out to myself or Joelle or any of the rest of the team if you're interested in continuing the conversation over LinkedIn. But thanks again, everyone, for awesome 2023. And we'll see you January 16th for our first episode of 2024. Cheers.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow FlourishDX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.